The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow, but the air in the private dining room suddenly froze. "Don't eat that!" the 5-year-old girl screamed, slapping the silver fork from the ruthless Mafia boss's hand. Gabriel Santoro went deathly pale, not out of anger, but because of what she said next. Gabriel Santoro did not believe in coincidences. In his line of work, a coincidence was usually just a poorly executed assassination attempt. At 34, Gabriel was the undisputed head of the Santoro crime syndicate, a sprawling organization that controlled the shipping lanes and union contracts from South Boston all the way to the docks of Providence. He had inherited a crumbling empire from his uncle and forged it into steel through a combination of ruthless efficiency and a terrifyingly calm demeanor. Gabriel wasn't a loud, cigar-chomping caricature. He was a phantom, a man who wore bespoke charcoal suits, spoke in quiet, measured tones, and commanded absolute loyalty through calculated fear. But lately, Gabriel's ironclad control was slipping, not from external threats, but from a persistent, gnawing paranoia. There was a leak. Federal indictments were suddenly looming over his top lieutenants, and shipments of untaxed imports were being intercepted by customs with alarming accuracy. FBI Special Agent Robert J. Kessler, a man whose real-life reputation for dismantling East Coast syndicates kept Gabriel up at night, was getting too close. Someone inside the Santoro family was talking. To silence the noise in his head, Gabriel maintained strict, almost obsessive routines. One of those routines involved a small, unassuming bakery on Hanover Street in the North End called La Dolce Forno. This was where Evelyn Davis worked. Evelyn was a 28-year-old single mother who had moved to Boston from Portland, Maine, fleeing a mountain of debt left behind by her gambling-addicted ex-husband, Brian Jenkins. She was drowning in overdue bills and the sheer exhaustion of raising her 5-year-old daughter, Lyra, on a pastry chef's meager salary. Evelyn possessed a quiet, resilient beauty, tired eyes that had seen too much, hands dusted with flour, and a fierce, uncompromising dedication to her child. Gabriel first noticed her on a rainy Tuesday in late October. He had stepped into the bakery, flanked by 2 discreet bodyguards, seeking a moment of quiet and a sfogliatella. The local shop owners usually trembled when Gabriel entered, stumbling over themselves to offer him their wares for free. Evelyn didn't know who he was. She looked at his expensive suit, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave him a polite but weary smile. "That'll be $4.50, she had said, her voice steady. Gabriel's lead bodyguard, a hulking enforcer named Dominic Ferrara, had bristled, reaching into his coat. Gabriel raised a single, gloved finger to stop him. He paid with a crisp $100 bill and told her to keep the change. Evelyn slid the $95.50 back across the counter. "I don't need charity, mister, just the $4.50. From that day on, Gabriel was captivated. He began visiting the bakery twice a week. He learned her name. He learned about Lyra, the bright-eyed, observant 5-year-old who often sat at a corner table coloring in her drawing books after preschool. For Gabriel, Evelyn represented something entirely alien to his world, untainted, stubborn honesty. The turning point occurred in early December. A splinter faction of low-level extortionists from the fading Romano crew decided to start shaking down the North End businesses. They targeted La Dolce Forno on a Thursday afternoon. 2 thugs entered, smashing a glass display case full of cannoli and demanding protection money from Evelyn. Gabriel happened to be sitting in his black SUV across the street, reviewing ledger reports with Dominic. He watched the glass shatter. He watched Evelyn instinctively throw herself in front of the corner booth where Lyra was sitting. The rage that erupted inside Gabriel was cold and absolute. He didn't send his men. He went in himself. The security footage of that afternoon was mysteriously erased, and the Boston Police Department never received a formal complaint. All Evelyn knew was that the elegant, quiet man, who always ordered the sfogliatella, walked into the bakery, locked the door behind him, and engaged the two thugs in a brief, brutal, and horrifyingly precise display of violence. It lasted less than 40 seconds. When it was over, the thugs were dragged out the back door by Gabriel's men, bleeding and broken. Gabriel had turned to Evelyn, adjusting his cuffs, not a drop of blood on his charcoal suit. "They won't bother you again, Evelyn. I apologize for the mess." Evelyn stared at him, terrified and trembling, clutching Lyra to her chest. She finally realized who he was. The whispers of the neighborhood suddenly made sense. "Who are you?" she had whispered. "Someone who appreciates your pastries," Gabriel replied softly, "and someone who despises bullies." Despite her terror, Evelyn felt an undeniable, magnetic pull toward him. He had protected her. Over the next few weeks, Gabriel's presence became a fixture in their lives. He paid for the broken glass anonymously. He started bringing Lyra small, thoughtful gifts. Not expensive toys, but rare coloring books and high-quality crayons. He was incredibly gentle with the child, a stark contrast to the monster she knew he could be. Evelyn knew she was playing with fire. Becoming entangled with a man like Gabriel Santoro was a death sentence or a prison term waiting to happen. But the loneliness of her struggle, combined with the profound safety she felt when he was near, eroded her defenses. A fragile, unspoken romance began to bloom. Stolen glances, lingering touches when he handed her payment, and hushed conversations over espresso after the bakery closed. But Gabriel's world was bleeding into his personal life. The FBI was tightening the noose, and the leak in his organization was providing them with highly classified logistical details about his port operations. Gabriel was paranoid, snapping at his underbosses, trusting no one. No one except Evelyn and Lyra. They were his sanctuary, and in his desperation to cling to that sanctuary, he made a critical, potentially fatal mistake. He brought them into his inner circle. It was a Sunday evening in mid-January. Gabriel had invited Evelyn and Lyra to his private estate in Brookline for dinner. It was a massive, fortress-like property, surrounded by wrought-iron gates, security cameras, and heavily armed men patrolling the perimeter. Evelyn had been hesitant to accept, deeply uncomfortable with exposing her daughter to the reality of Gabriel's life. But Gabriel had insisted, his voice tinged with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "It's safe here, Evelyn," he had pleaded over the phone. "Safer than anywhere else in the city. I need a few hours of peace. Please." Against her better judgment, Evelyn agreed. She dressed Lyra in a nice floral dress and wore a simple navy blue evening gown herself. When Gabriel's armored Cadillac picked them up, she felt a knot of profound anxiety tightening in her stomach. The estate was breathtaking, a sprawling mansion of dark wood, marble, and leather. Gabriel greeted them at the grand entrance. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes pronounced, but his face softened into a genuine smile when Lyra ran up to him, proudly showing him a drawing she had made of a black car. "It's beautiful, Lyra," Gabriel said, kneeling down to her eye level. He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes conveying a silent, desperate gratitude. The dinner was held in the private dining room, a lavish space dominated by a long mahogany table and illuminated by a crystal chandelier. The atmosphere was surprisingly warm. Gabriel had dismissed most of his staff to give them privacy, leaving only 2 trusted men standing guard in the hallway: Dominic Ferrara, his oldest friend and lead enforcer, and an older, quiet server named Thomas. For the first hour, The heavy burden of Gabriel's life seemed to lift. They ate a rich, homemade ragu. They laughed as Lyra told Gabriel a wildly exaggerated story about a squirrel she had seen at the park. Gabriel was attentive, pouring Evelyn's wine, his hand briefly brushing hers, sending a jolt of electricity up her arm. For a fleeting moment, Evelyn allowed herself to imagine that this could be normal, that he could just be a man, and she could just be a woman, sharing a Sunday dinner. But the undercurrent of tension never truly left the room. Gabriel's phone vibrated incessantly on the sideboard. Dominic would occasionally step into the room, exchange a loaded, silent glance with Gabriel, and step back out. Evelyn noticed the subtle tightening of Gabriel's jaw every time the door opened. As the main course was cleared, Gabriel smiled at Lyra. "I have a surprise for you, Lyra. I had someone special make dessert tonight." Evelyn looked at him, surprised. "You didn't?" "I pulled a few strings," Gabriel chuckled. "A chef from La Dolce Forno came by earlier. They made your favorite, Evelyn. Tiramisu." Evelyn smiled warmly, touched by the gesture. Thomas, the server, entered the room carrying a silver tray. He was a quiet man in his late 50s, someone Gabriel had employed for over a decade. On the tray sat 3 elegant, crystal bowls filled with rich, espresso-soaked tiramisu, dusted heavily with cocoa powder. Thomas placed a bowl in front of Evelyn, then one in front of Lyra, and finally, the largest portion in front of Gabriel. "Thank you, Thomas," Gabriel murmured, not looking up. "Enjoy, Mr. Santoro," Thomas replied softly, bowing his head slightly before retreating to the hallway. Gabriel picked up his silver spoon. He looked across the table at Evelyn, raising the spoon slightly in a silent toast to finding a light in the dark, he said softly. Evelyn smiled, picking up her own spoon. Lyra, however, was not looking at her dessert. She had slipped out of her chair a few minutes earlier to retrieve a dropped crayon near the doorway. She was standing by the heavy oak doors, staring down the hallway where Thomas and Dominic were standing. Gabriel brought the spoon to his mouth. The rich scent of espresso and mascarpone wafted up to him. He opened his mouth to take the first bite. "Don't eat that!" The scream was high-pitched, desperate, and shattered the quiet intimacy of the room like a gunshot. Gabriel froze, the spoon inches from his lips. Evelyn jumped, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Lyra! Honey, what's wrong?" Lyra ran over to Gabriel, her small face pale, her eyes wide with genuine terror. She reached up and violently slapped the silver fork, and the spoon, out of Gabriel's hand. The silver clattered loudly onto the mahogany table, splattering dark cocoa powder and cream across the pristine white table runner. Gabriel didn't react with anger. His survival instincts, honed by years of violence and betrayal, immediately kicked in. His blood ran cold. He looked down at the 5-year-old girl. "Lyra," he said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper. "Why did you do that?" Lyra was shaking, pointing a small, trembling finger toward the closed dining room doors. "The bad medicine. It's in the chocolate. He put the bad medicine in it." Evelyn rushed over, grabbing Lyra by the shoulders. "Lyra, what are you talking about? What medicine?" Gabriel stood up slowly. The color had completely drained from his face. He looked at the spilled dessert, then back to the child. "Lyra," Gabriel said, his tone commanding but calm, ensuring he didn't frighten her further. "Tell me exactly what you saw. Right now." Lyra sniffled, tears welling in her eyes. "When I went to get my green crayon, I looked through the crack in the door. The man with the food, he put a little glass bottle in his pocket. He sprinkled white powder on your bowl, Mr. Gabe. Not Mommy's, just yours. He stirred it in real fast." Gabriel's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Poison. Which man, Lyra? Gabriel asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the holster concealed beneath his suit jacket. Was it Thomas, the older man who brought the tray in? Lyra shook her head vigorously, her pigtails flying. No, not the old man. The other man. Evelyn frowned, confused. What other man, sweetie? There was only Thomas. The man with the snake, Lyra said, her voice dropping to a frightened whisper. The big man who is always with you, Mr. Gabe. The one with the green snake drawn on his hand. Gabriel went deathly pale. The air in the room was sucked out, leaving a suffocating, terrifying vacuum. The green snake tattoo, a coiled viper on the webbing of the right hand. It was Dominic Ferrara, his lead enforcer, the man who had taken a bullet for him 3 years ago, the man who was currently standing right outside the dining room door. Gabriel realized in a horrifying flash of clarity why the FBI was always one step ahead, why Agent Kessler knew about the port shipments, why the Romano crew had felt emboldened to attack the North End. Dominic wasn't just leaking information, he had sold Gabriel out completely, and tonight he was finishing the job to take over the family. Gabriel slowly pulled his customized 1911 pistol from his shoulder holster. He looked at Evelyn, who was now staring at the gun in horror, finally realizing the lethal reality of the world she was sitting in. Evelyn, Gabriel whispered, his eyes entirely black, completely devoid of the warmth they had held 5 minutes ago. Take Lyra. Get under the heavy oak sideboard. Do not make a sound. Evelyn didn't hesitate. The maternal instinct to protect her child overrode the paralyzing terror gripping her chest. She grabbed Lyra by the waist, practically throwing them both beneath the massive, carved oak sideboard that lined the far wall of the dining room. She pulled the child tight against her chest, burying Lyra's face in her shoulder, clamping a hand over the girl's mouth to muffle her frightened whimpers. Gabriel did not dive for cover. He moved with a terrifying, calculated grace. He kicked his heavy dining chair backward, sending it crashing into the wall to create a barricade, and positioned himself behind the thick mahogany table. He thumbed the safety off his 1911 pistol. The metallic click echoed like a cannon shot in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. Seconds ticked by. The heavy oak doors remained closed. Dominic Ferrara was a seasoned killer. He wouldn't just burst through the doors blindly. He would be waiting, listening for the sound of Gabriel choking on the poisoned dessert, waiting for the heavy thud of his boss hitting the floor. The fact that there was only silence and the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping told Dominic everything he needed to know. The plan had failed. "Dom!" Gabriel's voice boomed through the room, steady and completely devoid of fear. "You have 5 seconds to walk away. You get in your car, you drive to Logan, and you never step foot in Massachusetts again. That is the only mercy you get for 15 years of loyalty." A low, grating chuckle seeped through the heavy wood of the doors. "You're soft, Gabe," Dominic's voice filtered through, muffled but dripping with contempt. "You brought a baker and a brat into the inner sanctum. The family is bleeding. The Romanos are taking the docks, and you're busy playing house. I had to do it. The commission in New York gave me their blessing. You're a liability." "You poisoned a dessert in front of a child, Dom," Gabriel replied, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You're not a boss. You're a coward." The heavy double doors suddenly kicked open. Gabriel didn't wait to see the whites of his eyes. He fired twice through the thick wood of the left door, where he calculated Dominic's mass would be. Splinters exploded outward. A sharp grunt echoed from the hallway, followed immediately by a deafening barrage of return fire. Bullets tore through the dining room. Crystal shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces as the chandelier took a hit. raining glass down on the blood-red rug. Evelyn screamed into the hardwood floor, curling her body entirely over Lyra as chunks of plaster and mahogany rained down around them. Gabriel stayed low, returning fire with measured, suppressed precision. He wasn't spraying bullets. He was hunting. He caught a glimpse of a black suit jacket darting across the hallway threshold. Gabriel fired, hitting Dominic in the shoulder. The enforcer spun, his weapon discharging wildly into the ceiling before he stumbled back out of sight. "Thomas!" Gabriel roared, reloading his weapon with a fresh magazine from his jacket pocket in one fluid motion. "Thomas, get out of there!" There was no answer, only the heavy, wet sound of ragged breathing from the corridor. Gabriel couldn't wait. He knew Dominic would have backup outside. He had to end this before the estate's perimeter guards, who might also be loyal to Dominic, realized what was happening. Gabriel broke from cover, rolling across the floor and coming up in a crouch at the edge of the doorway. He peered into the hall. The sight made his stomach twist. Thomas, the loyal, quiet older server who had worked for the Santoro family since Gabriel was a teenager, lay motionless on the imported marble floor. A single gunshot wound to the chest told Gabriel that Dominic had eliminated the only witness to the poisoning before even stepping to the dining room doors. Dominic was leaning heavily against the far wall of the corridor, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his gun raised. His eyes met Gabriel's. There was no brotherhood left in them, only the desperate, feral panic of a cornered animal. "It's over, Gabe," Dominic spat, blood staining his teeth. "Even if you kill me, I gave Kessler the green light. The FBI is staging 2 miles down Route 9 right now. They think a massive heroin shipment just arrived here. SWAT is coming to blow your doors off. You're dead or doing life. It's done." Gabriel's expression didn't change. He raised his pistol, aiming squarely at the center of his oldest friend's chest. "I'll take my chances with the feds," Gabriel said quietly. He pulled the trigger. Dominic slumped against the wall, sliding down the expensive silk wallpaper, leaving a dark, smeared trail behind him until he hit the floor. Dead. Gabriel stood in the hallway for a long moment, the ringing in his ears gradually fading, replaced by the distant, horrifying wail of police sirens cutting through the cold Boston night. Dominic wasn't lying. The cavalry was coming, and Gabriel was standing in a room with a dead body, an unregistered firearm, and the woman he loved. Gabriel immediately holstered his weapon and ran back into the dining room. He dropped to his knees beside the sideboard. Evelyn was shaking uncontrollably, her face streaked with tears and dust, still shielding Lyra, who was sobbing quietly. "Evelyn, look at me," Gabriel commanded, his voice surprisingly gentle amidst the carnage. He reached out, his bloody hands hovering just inches from her face, afraid to touch her and taint her with his reality. "Are you hurt? Is Lyra hurt?" Evelyn shook her head, her breath catching in her throat as she looked at the shattered room, and then at the gun holstered at his side. "We're okay. Gabriel, what did you do?" "What I had to do to keep you alive," Gabriel said, his eyes locking onto hers with intense urgency. "Listen to me very carefully. The FBI is about to breach the gates. There will be shouting. There will be men with rifles. Do not run. Do not hide. You sit on the sofa in the living room, you hold Lyra, and you keep your hands visible. Tell them the truth. Tell them Dominic tried to kill us, and I defended us." But what about you?" Evelyn cried, panic rising in her voice. "They'll arrest you. They'll take you away." Gabriel offered a sad, resigned smile. "I've been a dead man walking for months, Evelyn. Tonight just forced my hand." He stood up, walking swiftly to a large, abstract oil painting on the far wall. He reached behind the heavy frame, manipulating a hidden dial, A soft click revealed a small wall safe. He pulled out a thick, black, leather-bound ledger and a small, encrypted hard drive. Outside, the screech of heavily armored tires tore through the driveway. Megaphones crackled to life, the booming, distorted voice of law enforcement echoing through the bullet-shattered windows. "FBI, this is a federal raid. Come out with your hands up." Gabriel walked back to Evelyn, helping her to her feet and guiding her and Lyra toward the front living room, away from the blood and the bodies. He knelt in front of Lyra one last time. "You are the bravest girl I have ever met," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You saved my life tonight, Lyra. Thank you." He stood up, looking at Evelyn. The unspoken words hung heavily between them. A future they could have had, stolen by the sins of his past. He handed her a piece of paper from his pocket. "Call this lawyer. He's expecting to hear from you. He will protect you." Before Evelyn could speak, the massive mahogany front doors of the estate were blown off their hinges by a breaching charge. Dozens of heavily armed SWAT officers poured into the foyer, laser sights cutting through the smoke and dust. Gabriel Santoro did not raise a weapon. He stood in the center of the room, his hands empty and raised high in the air, the black ledger tucked securely under his left arm. "I'm unarmed," Gabriel shouted over the chaos. "I want to speak to Special Agent Robert J. Kessler, now." 10 minutes later, the estate was locked down. Evelyn and Lyra were wrapped in shock blankets, being checked by paramedics in the back of an ambulance, heavily guarded by federal agents. Gabriel sat handcuffed in the back of an armored SUV, staring straight ahead. The door opened, and Special Agent Kessler slid into the seat beside him. Kessler was a hard-nosed, graying man who had spent a decade trying to put Gabriel in a federal penitentiary. He looked at the handcuffed Mafia boss with a mixture of triumph and suspicion. "You called for me, Santoro," Kessler said gruffly. "You're looking at a murder charge, racketeering, and narcotics trafficking. Dominic's tip finally gave us the probable cause we needed for the warrant." Gabriel turned his head, his eyes cold and sharp. "Dominic lied to you, Kessler. There are no drugs here. He used you as a hit squad to finish the job he botched in my dining room. He poisoned my food. When it failed, he tried to shoot me. I killed him in self-defense." Kessler scoffed. "Self-defense? That's a rich defense for a mob boss. A jury will love it." "They won't need to hear it," Gabriel said smoothly, gesturing with his chin toward the black ledger sitting on the seat between them. "Because you and I are going to make a deal." Kessler laughed dryly. "You have nothing to bargain with, Gabriel. Your empire is crumbling. We have you dead to rights." "You have nothing," Gabriel corrected him quietly. "You have a dead enforcer and a clean house. But what I have is the name of every corrupt Boston politician on my payroll. I have the offshore routing numbers for the Romano family's money laundering operations. And most importantly, I have proof that the deputy director of your own field office has been taking bribes from Dominic for 2 years to turn a blind eye to the docks." Kessler froze. The smugness vanished from his face, replaced by a wary, intense focus. If what Gabriel was saying was true, this wasn't just a Mafia bust. It was the largest systemic corruption takedown in the history of the East Coast. It was a career-making, history book-writing case. "What do you want?" Kessler asked, his voice low. "Witness protection," Gabriel stated firmly. "For me, for Evelyn Davis, and for her daughter, Lyra. Absolute, ironclad immunity. The Santoro family is done. I'm tearing it down to the studs myself. But they come with me, and we disappear." Kessler stared at him, calculating the political fallout, the risk, and the sheer magnitude of the evidence. He looked at the ledger, then back at Gabriel. He knew Gabriel Santoro was a man of his word, a rare trait in their shared, ugly world. "I'll have to make some calls," Kessler said finally, picking up the ledger. "Make them fast," Gabriel replied, leaning back against the seat, his eyes drifting toward the ambulance where Evelyn and Lyra were sitting. "I'm retiring." Over the next 6 months, the Boston underworld was ripped apart. True to his word, Gabriel provided devastating testimony in closed-door grand jury sessions. The Romano crew was decimated. Corrupt politicians were indicted in sweeping dawn raids. The leaks in the FBI were plugged with federal prison sentences. And then Gabriel Santoro vanished. There were rumors, of course. Some said he was killed by a rival hitman before he could be relocated. Others said he took his hidden millions and fled to a non-extradition country in South America. The truth, however, was much simpler and hidden far away from the blood-soaked streets of the East Coast. The Boston bakery is closed, replaced by a quiet cafe in coastal Oregon. Gabriel no longer wears charcoal suits or commands a criminal empire. He bakes bread. Evelyn manages the storefront, and Lyra colors in a corner booth. The Santoro Syndicate is just a ghost story now. Sometimes, the most powerful move a king can make is to step off the board entirely, simply to save his 2 beautiful queens.